This is a splatterpunk story. It is filled with gratuitous violence, sex, and lots of bad language. The Meat Wagon by A.P. Gilbert. It was known by some as the Cuntmobile, by others as the Fuck Wagon. It was what it was, a whorehouse on dusty rails of iron. 2 stops only, 300 miles between. 300 miles of blood, semen, and good old-fashioned screams. Screams of pleasure or screams of pain, depending on the desires of the clientele. Everything was catered for, and anyone was welcome, so long as they had the silver to pay. These men did. The 5 men who stood at the station when the meat wagon pulled in with a rush of sickly scented smoke and a cry of reluctant brakes, paying their coin to the black man when he stepped from the engine bay. 5 debauched men who chose their meat with fingers pointing silently through carriage windows at painted whores with fearful eyes. 5 iniquitous men with hands on carriage doors, sick thoughts in their minds and erections stiffening in dirty pants. The 6th man stepped aboard the final carriage as the train began to move. He turned and pulled the silver timepiece from a pocket in his immaculate black frock coat. He looked at the initials R.F. inscribed into the back and smiled. The black man shoveled another pile of coal into the firebox and watched as the flames licked harshly between the black rocks. 10 long years he'd been shoveling from that same pile of coal into that same hellish pit, never relighting it, never restocking the fuel. He couldn't remember his life before the train, not even his name, but he remembered with clarity every day since. He could picture the dead faces of 1,000 nameless women whom he had thrown from this iron monster to be devoured by the coyotes and the crows. He scratched at the hard black mask which covered his face, his dry, chapped fingers touching the ice-cold metal. How he longed to remove his shroud, how he longed to touch the skin of his face again. 10 long years of service, and his time was nearly up. The black man had paid his dues, but for what? He wasn't aware. All he knew was that he would be there soon. Grace Edgley looked at the man in front of her, his hard pricks sticking out of his dirty yellow underpants in an unwavering salute. "Did you hear me, bitch?" he spat. She'd heard him. He tugged at his ragged black beard as he kicked one leg from the brown pants lying at his ankles. In the years she'd been traveling inside this roaming locomotive, she'd not heard a demand of this nature. He had asked for a child. He walked across the room to her, small puffs of sawdust lifting from the floor at each step, his cock bouncing in front of him, as if on its own volition. She licked her lips and found her voice. "Wouldn't you rather let me?" He cut her off with a raised hand, and with one more step was an inch from her nose. She felt his hot, pungent breath touch her lips. He grabbed her hair, which had been tied up in a neat plait, and turned away, dragging her backwards. She grasped at his hand as her feet kicked along the floor, but he was large, and his grip strong. Grace found herself flung face first into the bed beside the window. He straddled her naked back, pulling her head backwards with his left hand on her forehead. She struggled to breathe, trying to move around, attempting to shift his weight. He released her forehead, then struck her in the side of the face with one huge fist. Grace screamed out and felt heat spreading from her ear and down her neck. He avoided her flailing punches and twisted her arm out so that her hand was between her shoulder blades. She tensed, but kept quiet. He leaned forward and whispered into Grace's ear. She felt the wiry hair of his beard against her cheek. "You will do as I fucking say." She could barely hear him over the ringing in her ear. "Okay," she answered softly. After a few moments he released her and began to stand. She waited until he had stepped away from her bare body before twisting and propping herself up on her elbows. He leered at her big breasts as she stood, and he smiled at her with a sideways grin half full of blackened teeth. She scowled back before walking past him out of her suite into the corridor. The black man flicked off the monitor to Suite 3. The name Gerald Diath stayed lit at the bottom for a second or two before blinking out of sight. The black man had often wondered how the train knew who was in each suite. Wondered, but never discovered. Not that this was the only puzzling occurrence on a train so full of mystery. He looked at the surveillance screens which constantly recorded the corridors running down the right-hand side of the train. He thought he saw something in the rear carriage and zoomed in using a small black knob beneath a line of flashing lights. Only a heat shimmer, nothing solid. He flicked on the monitor to Suite 7. The name Billy Flack scrolled the width of the screen before the view to the room's interior became clear. Billy moaned again as he reached completion. The red-haired woman kneeling down below his waist, holding him between her lips, moving back and forth. He enjoyed watching it. Billy had been reluctant to come here at first, but his pa had insisted. He had even paid for it, a 16th birthday gift. Billy was still a virgin. The boy bucked against her, clutching the back of her head as he released his seed into her mouth with a cry. He lifted his hands. She moved slowly backwards, letting his softening cock fall from her mouth, before looking into his face with sultry eyes and a smiling, close-lipped grin. Billy leant back against the hard wooden wall, peering from the window at the barren landscape rocketing past. He listened to the clackety-clackety-clackety-clack of the wheels against the rails. The noise vibrated through his body, and he was aware of his erection already beginning to return. "What the fuck do you think I am?" Gerald asked again. "You asked for a child," Grace said, a smile touching the corner of her mouth. She had returned to the suite, cradling a baby under a year old. The child lay, eyes almost closed, wrapped in a soft woolen blanket, cooing gently. The children of the working women, for there is a surety that children will be born on a train such as this, lived in a carriage at the rear. The girls groomed for their time aboard the iron beast, the boys forgotten the moment they left the comfort of the womb. Grace looked down at the child. She knew that she would never let this man take her. "Do you really think you're in a position to mock me?" the man said with a snarl as he slid the small window behind him back on its runners. His voice softened. Sand and sawdust formed a vortex in the corner of the room. His long hair blew in front of his face. "Bring me the child." He held his arms out to her. Grace looked at the baby, then at him, then past him to the open window. "No," she said. "If I have to come to you, I'll cut your tits off before we're done." Voice cracking, the calming tone gone. Grace didn't answer, just cast her eyes back down at the innocent face of the baby. Let's hope this works, she thought. I've had enough of this shit. The man, Gerald, strode towards the naked woman and the child. Give me that thing. He reached out to grab the baby, but Grace turned to her right. The bearded man grasped Grace's arm and whipped her back round. Grace unsheathed the short blade from its scabbard beneath the infant's wrap, swinging it in an arc, slicing into the stomach of the man. She felt the knife tear through sun-baked skin, deep and long. The baby began to cry. The man fell to his knees, arms wide, unbelieving. What the hell did you just do? He tried to stand, but his foot slipped in the mess which had spilled from the hole in his belly. He slipped sideways, pulling more of his guts from the wound like a wet and bloody tug-of-war. Gerald's head hit the wall, eyes rolling in their sockets. Only the whites were visible. Grace turned to her bed and put the baby on the soft bedroll. When she turned back, the man had roused. Although he still lay on his side, he began to pull at his soft innards, trying to pack them back into his blood-drenched belly. I'm gonna fucking kill you, he kept saying. I'm gonna fucking kill you. Grace sat down next to the baby and stroked her hair until she had settled and her eyes had begun to close. She reached under the bed, pulling out her pair of brown knee-high stiletto boots. She watched his frantic efforts as she carefully laced them up. Grace stood and stepped forward. The desert sun was bright and unforgiving. The black man looked at the desolate landscape as they made their way along the sand-covered rails. He had seen that shimmer again while Grace Edgley was performing her severe act of redemption, a shimmer moving slowly up the train. He knew what it was. He knew him as Raymond Fogg. The monitor to Suite 11 flickered on, and he turned to watch. So what'll be your pleasure, be handsome? Her voice was sweet and sexy, with a southern twang. The man in front of her was a pleasant surprise, tall and good-looking. He had a 2-day stubble on his cheeks and a cigarette at the corner of his mouth. What's yours? He asked. Matilda walked across the floor towards him, unbuttoning her low-cut blouse. She opened it up, revealing her firm white breasts and tiny pink nipples. He reached out and took one between finger and thumb, pinching it. She moaned. Harder. I like it hard. I hoped you'd say that. The good-looking man seized her throat, spat his cigarette to the ground, and bit down onto the top of her breast. Matilda tried to pull away, but he had his arm around her waist. She smacked her fists against his shoulders and then at his head. He released his bite and lifted his head before thrusting it forward, plowing it into the woman's face. She fell to the floor, head striking the corner of the bed. Matilda moaned as she was pulled viciously onto her back. Her small breasts shook gently. Blood seeped from the wound just below her collarbone and stained one side of her white blouse. She tried to turn her head. Gray filled her world. She struggled. Strength drained along with the color. Cold steel touched her skin. She tasted copper at the back of her throat. The cowboy turned Matilda's face to his. He kissed her deeply as he moved his weapon up her long, white leg. It reached her thigh, and rough hands pulled her legs apart. She was unable to oppose. The whore was dry, resisting the barrel of his Colt SAA. He spat and pushed harder until her hole yielded and let it painfully in. Matilda let out a small cry, but she didn't move away. He smiled as he watched until the pistol was up to his trigger finger. He cocked the hammer with one split, nailed thumb. Raymond Fogg, the gentleman in the black frock coat, was known by many names. Roy Frith, Richard Fairweather, Randall Flagg, among others. He watched the children play in the unlit wagon at the rear of his train. He smiled as their mothers, aunts, grandmothers, the unchosen whores, held them tight with love in their eyes. They saw him watching and cowered away from his smiling face. He chuckled, a deep, inhuman sound as he raised one hand to his brow in a salute, before adjusting his gold cufflinks, tightening his cravat, and turning away. Gerald had just managed to put his gut back into his swollen, distended belly when Grace's heel stamped down on his naked penis with such force that his scrotum split, one testicle spilling out, hanging onto a thick, bloody rope. The man retched and drew his knees up, opening the gash across his stomach, allowing his guts to spill out again with a gush of blackening blood. He tried to breathe, but all that he produced was a thin whine. "You're not looking too hot, mister." Grace bit down gently, seductively, on the tip of her tongue and raised one eyebrow. "I think your child fucking days are over." He looked at her with wet eyes, and a fury more extreme than any he had felt before. He wanted to speak, wanted to tell her that he was going to shove her little knife so far up her disease-filled cunt that it would graze the back of her throat. He wanted to speak, but he couldn't. The pain in his cock and the ache in his belly had linked arms and become best of friends. The pain was so huge that he was struggling to breathe. Grace lifted her foot again and rested the point of the heel on the surface of one open eye. Gerald's arm slapped uselessly at her calves. The eye blinked reflectively but was unable to close as she continued to apply the pressure. Even after these 10 years, the black man had not got used to the depravity aboard the train and was sickened by the abilities of humankind. He closed his eyes beneath his mask and breathed deeply. He was so tired, but he still had a job to do. The monitor for Suite 13 flickered on. "And that's why everyone in Arizona knows the name of William Stryker." Eleanor fought against her yawn as he concluded his tale. "So we gonna fuck yet?" She lay impatiently on her bed. It was the first time she had wanted a client to get a buck up. She was getting bored, and if she didn't get him moving, the black man wouldn't be impressed. "Hi up, I'm getting there," he said. He was an old boy, looked like a retired gold prospector, long gray beard and hair tied up in a loose, greasy ponytail at the back of his head. She, Eleanor, was at least 30 years his junior, firm breasts and a purple uplifting corset top which showed her trim belly and sleek shoulders. She stood from the bed and walked across to the chair where Stryker sat. She reached out and stroked his bearded cheek. "I'm not one for waiting." She unlaced one side of her corset and started on the other. "Now, why don't you help a gal out and slip those big heavy boots off?" He bent down with a struggle, never taking his eyes from the dark-skinned breasts which had been released from their silky prison, and fingered his laces. Eleanor reached behind her head and pulled the stick which held her hair at the top of her head in a neat bun. Her hair spilled down like a silky black waterfall, and Randolph's breath caught in his throat. He returned to his laces with a renewed fervor. The woman with the coffee-colored skin took his hand and pulled him up. He put one hand on the arm of the chair to help him progress. He was shorter than her. It ceased to matter when she crouched down. She unbuttoned his pants and they dropped to the floor, revealing a gray-haired, semi-erect penis. She breathed through her mouth and tried hard not to show her disgust. She stood again and led Randolph over to the bed, where he lay down on his back, eyes never leaving her tight body. She wasted no more time as she bent and slid her knickerbockers to her ankles, revealing her hairless sex. The old man licked his lips and reached out a hand to touch the folds of skin between her legs. He was breathing heavily. Eleanor climbed on top of the man, his cock now standing proud. She spat on her hand and rubbed it between her legs, leaving it shimmering and wet. She lowered herself down slowly until he was all the way in. She moved herself up and down, her hands against his thighs, until he closed his eyes and was panting, mouth open wide. She kept him deep and rocked backwards and forwards, suddenly surprised at the moistness her body was beginning to spill within her. His panting became quicker, louder, and she closed her eyes and leant her head back. His cock began to pulsate with an imminent ejaculation, and Eleanor tightened her pelvic muscles to draw his orgasm out. He tensed, and she opened her eyes. He stared back, eyes wide, hands clutched across his chest. She felt him shoot his semen deep inside her and watched as his expression never changed. She stopped moving, and his hands released each other and flopped to their sides. His eyes still stared up at her, unseeing, dead. Eleanor shrugged and started to move again, leaning back against the dead man's thighs as she rode him to her own end. The black man looked away from the monitor to knock on his door. Rat-a-tat-tat. It was barely noticeable over the click-a-clack-clack of the locomotive's drive, but the black man always knew when his cab was touched. He looked to his left. There was a narrow doorway which led to a corridor attached to the outer edge of the tender. He stood and walked through. He had to turn his body sideways and shuffle. He reached down to the hand wheel on the solid door and turned it. The door opened outward, and he stepped onto the windy gangway. A large man stood in front of him, just inside the foremost carriage, at a door to the first suite. The black man gazed at him through his unmoving mask. The head of the train's tallest client was slightly bent down so as not to touch the ceiling. He had a shotgun shell necklace which hung over his bare, hairless chest and to his heavily muscled stomach. The black man pulled a notebook from the front pocket of his dark blue overalls and ran a finger down the inked list he had made from the names on the monitors. He looked up again at the cowboy as he found his name. Manfred Burks. Manfred moved aside as the black man peered past him at the blood-soaked slab of meat in the corner of Suite 33. There were no obvious features of it ever being remotely human. Maybe, he thought, he could avoid having to look at another set of cold, dead eyes. "I want another woman brought to my room," the man said in a huge Texan voice that was easily heard over the rushing air from the open door. The black man turned his head upwards and pointed at a plaque nailed perfectly straight on the frame above the door. Manfred began to read. Oh, fuck this, he said. "I don't read. Who the fuck reads?" The black man looked straight into Manfred's eyes and began to speak. His voice was slow, breathless, and painfully raw, like a razor blade cutting through stone. The large man shook visibly as the sound etched its way beneath the mask. "No refunds," he said. "No exchanges. No arguments. Any complaints must be made in writing to me," the black man said, lengthening "me" until it began to sound like a scream. "But how can I expect someone as plainly stupid as Manfred Burks to write anything apart from his own name?" Manfred struck without warning, a huge fist aimed at the black man's head. The masked man stepped backwards, raising his own fist to meet the Texan's. The two hands connected, and although the driver's hand was dwarfed, it was the bones of the cowboy's that shattered. Manfred screamed out and clutched at his hand with his other shovel-sized limb. "Look what the fuck you done, you little freak!" he roared. But the black man didn't look. He turned away, unperturbed. Manfred ran at him. As he reached the open door to the gangway, the black man turned and seized the cowboy's throat. His fingers dug in around the man's trachea. Manfred slapped at him, trying to break his hold, but the black man did not falter. With ease, he lifted the heavily muscled man off his feet. Twisting, he slammed him against the ground in the doorway to his corridor. The black man stepped over him and took hold of the handwheel. He pulled the door against the fallen man's cheek. Manfred got his hand up and held onto the rim. It made no difference. The black man continued to pull and watched as the metal began to draw blood against the man's face. The crack of Manfred Burke's jaw was audible, and even that close to the driving wheel and pistons. The man tried to cry out. As he released the tension of his clenched teeth, the door moved quicker, nipping his cheek up to the ear. With it, a number of rear teeth. The black man saw the Texan had lost consciousness then, but he continued to pull until the top half of his head rolled inside, looking like a snack bowl. The door latched closed. "Don't you think you should stop that, my dear?" Grace turned at the well-spoken Englishman, and in her shock almost let her heel slip deeper into the gutted man's eye socket. She removed her foot from the lightly breathing blind man and stood up straight. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Oh, don't worry, my sweet. I often have that effect. People seem to lose their nerve around me." His voice was soft and gentle, but a voice that demanded complete submission. "Now, do you really think you should be doing that to one of our clients?" Grace shook her head slowly. She gazed into the blue eyes of the man in front of her and watched them change to brown and then to green. His face was constantly moving, changing, yet always staying the same. He was beautiful. "Why don't you take a walk with me, Grace?" He took her hand. He helped her to step toward the man and put his hand onto one bare buttock as they walked outside. She glanced backwards in the bed where she had laid the sleeping baby, but the child was gone, and soon enough Grace's memory of her disappeared too. She walked alongside the gentleman, but she felt as if she were floating. Her limbs were not her own, yet she still felt many cold hands touching her skin, cold hands that all belonged to him, to Raymond Fogg. She closed her eyes and let herself be led. Billy looked up from between the girl's legs at the man standing in the doorway to his suite. The girl, Maybelle Boyd, lay naked, hands wrapped in knotted red hair, a moan of pleasure caught in her closed throat. Neither of them spoke against the unexpected interruption. "Oh, this just won't do, will it, Grace?" He didn't wait for an answer, nor did he get one. "I can't have this thing going on in my train today." He waved a finger between the two naked people in front of him. "Today is a very important day." They all looked at him, silent, unable to move. "Oh dear," he said in that soft and friendly voice. "How did you think this would pan out? Pay your coin and take your woman when you leave? That isn't the kind of establishment I'm running here." He chuckled softly before continuing. "My train isn't the kind of place where that happens." He walked over and sat down on the bed of Maybelle's head, taking her hand in his own and stroking it gently. "I am sorry, my dear. You see, today we've had a change of destination, and they're rather strict at the next station. Only one person per room. I know, he said, though no one had commented. "It's a strange rule, but I'm not the one that makes them up." He chuckled again. "I don't like to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm afraid that only one of you can leave this room. I'll leave it to you to decide who." Billy and Maybelle looked towards each other as the suited man stood and walked away. The door closed, and the silence was broken. Grace followed Fogg through the narrow corridors, past suite doors both open and closed. They passed from one carriage to another and then into a third. As they reached the first suite, a shot rang out and a hole appeared in the wall beside Fogg's head. He turned to face the hole, and Grace saw the wound in the side of his face. One eye hung from a bloody socket. His lips were turned up in a grin. "Ah, splendid!" He stepped over to open the door. Matilda lay on the ground in the center of the room. Her face had been mutilated, skin peeled away from bone, her tongue lolled around in a cavernous mouth filled with broken teeth and saliva-diluted blood. A gaping hole filled most of her lower stomach, where her insides had been turned into a bubbling mess of blood and bile. Black burns lined the lips of her vulva. The skin had blistered and burst. "Splendid!" Fogg said again as he looked over at the old man silently in the corner. "I really wish I could stay and observe, Mr. Compton, but alas, I have other business today." Elmo Compton nodded. "Please continue." Fogg turned back to the door, and Grace saw his face had returned to its former beauty. The black man waited in his sooty cab as Fogg walked down the narrow corridor beside the tender. "It has been 10 years, he said, stepping through. The black man saw him for who he truly was and backed away. "You are free to go." Fogg's voice was like pulled testicles on ripping nails. "Unless, my friend, you would like to stay." The black man shook his head. Fogg reached and took the black mask in one manicured hand. It slipped off with ease, and the black man felt air against his skin. "What is my name?" The first question that came to mind. "You'll find out," he said, "in time." And then the black man was gone. Grace pulled at the arm of the eyeless cowboy as she dragged him through the dark corridor outside the locomotive's tender. This is what he had requested, so that is what she had done. Fogg smiled as he saw them. "Thank you, my dear," a genuine-looking smile. "I will join you shortly." Grace turned and walked back to stand outside. She was still naked. Even in the cold air, her body dripped with sweat. She looked at the bloody trail from the body she had destroyed. Touching herself, she smiled. Gerald was still alive, somehow. His guts had spilled from his belly again. "How would you like to live, my friend?" Fogg asked. The cowboy nodded once and vomited onto his chest. "I'm very glad. Do you have a pen? No? Oh, well, I'm sure we can think of something." Fogg pulled a folded sheet from the inside pocket of his black suit jacket and spread it in front of the cowboy. He reached down, pulled a fat coil of intestines up into his mouth. He bit into it, spilling thick black fluid down his chin and onto the white collar of his shirt. He took the cowboy's finger and dipped it into the gurgling tube before guiding it to the bottom of the sheet. "Sign here, my friend." Grace turned as Fogg appeared behind her. The heat had intensified. She looked out across the barren landscape to the horizon. Reds and yellows and oranges swam across the skies. Rocky outcrops grew in places which had been flat moments before. Purple, swirling clouds burst into being and spanned to the ground. "I'm glad we could be here together, my dear." Fogg spoke to her, but looked past her into the distance. "It is a pleasure to have such beautiful company." He stroked her bare shoulder. She smiled as she reached down to unbutton his pants. "You'll enjoy this, my dear," he said. She nodded as his pants opened up, but when she saw the size of the thing Fogg had for her, she began to scream. He didn't even recognize his hands. He looked around, but nothing jogged his memory. There was nothing to jog his memory. 2 iron rails running across endless sand. He reached down and touched one of the rails. It was cold, even in the bright heat of the sun. He blinked at the sensation, at the coldness. He remembered his face, hard, cold like ice, black ice. Then it was gone. He looked up at the sun, squinting. He needed to move. He would die out here in the desert. He stepped between the tracks and began to walk. The end.